Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Khouwaga Youssoufzai will defend the academic thesis, The Thorn of Tedium, Boredom as a Precursor to Aggression and Self-Harm. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you. Dear Pro-Rector, members of the committee, dear supervisors, colleagues, family, and friends, welcome to my presentation. In the next few minutes, I will share with you the research I've been working on in the last few years. So boredom is an experience we are all familiar with. It is an everyday sort of state that we often associate with things like restlessness, monotony, time ticking away, and a general dissatisfaction in the moment. Boredom signals to us that we are no longer engaged with what we're doing, and it motivates us to seek experiences that are different from the one that we're stuck in. Studies have linked boredom to a range of different behaviors. For example, boredom can lead us to be more impulsive. It can lead us to seek social interaction. It can lead us to snack more, but it's also been associated with drug use and gambling. So it's clear that boredom is an aversive experience and we will go to great lengths to escape it. But is it possible that in trying to escape boredom, we would even inflict harm? So we investigated this question in two parts. And when it comes to inflicting harm on others, the behavior that we're talking about is, of course, aggression. And our first objective was to examine whether boredom leads to aggression. So in the research, we define aggression as any behavior that is directed towards another person, carried out with the intent to cause harm. In addition to that, the perpetrator must believe that their behavior will harm the other person and that this other person is motivated to avoid the behavior. So there have been some studies demonstrating at least a correlation between boredom and aggression. These were studies that used questionnaires, and they showed that people who tend to experience boredom more often also tend to be more aggressive in their daily life. Boredom also became a topic of conversation during the COVID-19 lockdowns, where we saw that there was an increase in aggression among Dutch youth. And at the time, this was anecdotally attributed to boredom that we also saw more of in that period. So these findings tell us something about a link between boredom and aggression in the sense that they co-occur, but they don't prove that boredom actually leads to aggression. In order to establish this, we have to test this systematically in an experimental setting where we induce boredom in people and compare their behavior to a control group where we induce a neutral mood. So far, only one experimental study has tested the boredom-aggression link under such conditions, and this study provided some evidence that boredom may lead to sadism, which is a very specific form of aggression, but it's not clear whether boredom also would lead to more common forms of aggression. So altogether, there seems to be a link between boredom and aggression, but we need to investigate this further. So we did this through a set of experiments, which I will share with you today. So first, we conducted an experiment in our lab where we looked at whether boredom would have a lingering effect on aggression. So meaning that directly after a period of boredom, our participants were given the opportunity to behave aggressively. So we induced boredom in our participants through a video that they watched, which consisted of an 83-second clip of a science documentary. But that is not all. We actually took this clip and put it on repeat for 45 minutes straight. And then for the control group, instead of watching the same clip over and over again, the control group watched a single regular 45-minute segment of the same documentary. And after this, we measured their aggressive behavior in a computer task where they could administer noise blasts to a supposed other participant. And specifically, our participants were able to choose the loudness and the duration with which these noise blasts would play in the other person's headphones. So these noise blasts were used as an indication of their level of aggression. Then we compared the behavior of the people in the boredom group with that of the people in the control group. And in this experiment, we actually did not find a statistically significant difference between our experimental groups, meaning that people in the boredom group did not show more aggressive behavior compared to people in the control group. And considering that the study I mentioned previously, where they showed a link between boredom and sadism, in that study, they measured the sadistic aggression during the boredom period rather than after. So we wondered whether our lack of findings was due to this difference in timing. So we conducted another study, this time online, and we had people watch a boring video again. This time it consisted of a short 2-second clip that was repeated over and over again for 7 minutes straight, while the control group watched a regular 7-minute segment of a documentary. During this, they had the opportunity to interact with 2 3D dolls on their screen that represented a random other person. And they were able to either stab pins into one of these dolls or place 4-leaf clovers on the other doll. The pin stabbing was a measure of their aggression, and the clovers were used to offer participants a positive pro-social alternative. And of course, we found that boredom led to an increased use of these clovers since, well, it makes sense since boredom would lead to an increased activity anyway. But in this study, we also found that boredom led participants in the boredom group. Participants in the boredom group showed a higher aggression score, meaning they stabbed more pins in the doll compared to participants in the control group, even though both groups had this positive option as well. So then we repeated this experiment. This time we presented participants with the option to stab pins into a doll that represented another person, but also a doll that represented themselves. During the video induction, participants could then choose to stab pins in both, neither, or only one. And we actually this time did not find that boredom led to an increased pin stabbing in either. So we found no difference between our experimental groups. So we decided to repeat the experiment. This time, we offered participants only the option to stab pins in one doll representing a random other person. But here again, we did not find an effect of boredom on this behavior. So in the end, our findings tentatively support the hypothesis that boredom can lead to aggression, at least in the presence of a pro-social alternative. Although we need more research to see to what extent our findings can be replicated and to what extent they would generalize to other settings. Our second objective was to examine whether boredom leads to harm towards the self, meaning self-harm. And there is some evidence suggesting a link between boredom and self-harm. So studies examining people's past experiences using questionnaires have found that people who engage in self-harm often report that boredom is one of the reasons why they engage in this behavior. And in addition to that, we see that in settings where people can't easily escape boredom, like prisons and inpatient facilities, in those settings, the boredom rates are also very high, or the boredom rates are high and the self-harm rates are high. So again, we see a co-occurrence of boredom and self-harm, but we don't know if boredom actually leads to self-harm. So previous lab studies have shown that when you induce boredom in people and give them the opportunity to, they will voluntarily apply electric shocks to themselves. But these studies did not measure people's pain thresholds. So we don't know if people actually choose to seek out pain out of boredom. So we need to test this hypothesis experimentally, and that's what we did. So we set up another experiment, and here we made our participants watch a very boring video again, this time consisting of a 36-second clip that we repeated for 42 minutes straight. And the control group, instead of having to watch the same clip over and over again, they watched a single regular 42-minute segment of a documentary. And during this, they had the opportunity to apply electric shocks to themselves, which represented self-harm in this context. And we measured not only the frequency with which they applied these shocks, but also the intensity, meaning the painfulness. So initially, we did not see that boredom led participants to shock themselves more when we compared it to the control group. But this was only the case for people who didn't already have a history of real-life self-harm. We found that people who did have this real-life self-harm history, these people were more likely to shock themselves when they were in the boredom group compared to those in the control group. Then looking at the intensity of the electric shocks, meaning how painful they were, we found that regardless of whether people had a history of self-harm or not, boredom led all our participants to administer electric shocks to themselves that exceeded their own pain thresholds. So this experiment demonstrated to us that boredom can lead us to voluntarily seek out even painful experiences, but it begs a new question. What happens if people have a positive alternative to engage in other than self-harm? So we set up another experiment, and this time we induced boredom in people by having them type the same word over and over and over and over again for 15 minutes. And for the control group, they were instructed to describe in detail how they travel from home to university, also for a period of 15 minutes. And instead of electric shocks this time, our participants were able to press a button to play aversive sounds for themselves during both the boredom and the control task. And this sound consisted of a short audio clip of a screaming pig. Then, as an additional positive option, participants could choose to play a pleasant sound for themselves, which consisted of chirping birds. So in this way, the experiment was a little bit more like real life, since we rarely only have negative options to engage in when we're bored. So as you can expect, we found that boredom led people to play the pleasant sounds more often when we compared it to the control group. But we also found that people in the boredom group still were more inclined to play the aversive sound when we compared that score to the control group, even though both had the positive option as well. So both of these experiments showed us that boredom can lead us to voluntarily engage in things that we would usually find aversive. And so they support the hypothesis that boredom leads to self-harm. Taken together, our findings are in line with the hypothesis that boredom can lead us to inflict harm on others and on ourselves. Apparently, boredom is aversive enough to lead us down this potentially destructive path. So our findings spark all kinds of questions. For example, why would boredom lead to both aggression and self-harm? Are the underlying mechanisms the same? Maybe aggression and self-harm help us to regain a sense of control when we're bored. Is it maybe a specific form of boredom that is relevant here? Or are context and environment an important factor? Either way, our results have a number of implications. So if boredom is indeed a breeding ground for aggression and self-harm, this means that if we want to improve prevention and treatment of these behaviors, we may need to focus on targeting boredom. In a clinical setting, this might mean that people who are at risk for aggressive or self-harming behaviors, these people could potentially benefit from a reduction in their boredom if that's something that they experience a lot. So this means that the risk for harmful behavior could be mitigated by helping these people find more meaningful and engaging activities to get involved in. Another useful approach would be to focus on reframing boredom. So this would be in line with, for example, the practice of mindfulness, because it turns out that boredom and mindfulness are inversely related to each other, which means that mindfulness exercises can be used to reduce boredom in people. And this could be applied in a therapeutic setting, but I think it's also relevant in a broader sense to our world today. So with the way that we are glued to our screens nowadays, it may seem like we are escaping boredom altogether. But it actually turns out that the endless scrolling and the constant switching between short form content is increasing our levels of boredom. So from the outside, it may seem like we are engaged with something, but we really aren't. Maybe this also means that our idea of what boredom typically looks like nowadays needs an update. Either way, our findings demonstrate that we should be careful not to underestimate boredom, not only in a situational sense, but also as the thorn of tedium that pricks at our ability to be meaningfully and mindfully engaged with the world around us. Thank you for your attention. I now give the word back to the Pro-Rector.
Thank you for your very clear presentation. We now start the opposition, and the opposition will be opened by Professor Lawrence Klaas. She is Professor of Clinical Psychology at Leuven University. Welcome to Maastricht University. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, dear candidates. First of all, I would like to congratulate you and your supervisory team for this very interesting work. You have written a PhD consisting of 7 chapters and 5 empirical studies, and several manuscripts are already published in peer-reviewed journals. So well done, congratulations. But of course, I'm also here today to ask some more critical questions. My own research is also focusing on non-suicidal self-injury. So I will start with a question about your experimental way of imitating or trying to imitate non-suicidal self-injury. You use 3 different methods to injure yourself. If you would redo or can redo new experiments, which manipulation would you use and which comes closest to the real experience of non-suicidal self-injury in your opinion, and why?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and for your question. I think if I had to choose the one that comes closest to real life self-harm from the studies that we did, I think I would go with the electric shocks. Based on, well, intuitively, it seems it's closer because you actually experience real pain, and we measured people's pain thresholds. Also from the empirical research, I think the electric shocks are one of the most validated. If I were to do it over again the way you explained it, and I had the option to, I think I would be interested in doing something with virtual reality. I know there is some, I think maybe one study that I read about that used this, but it's so new. But I think that would probably be like the future most ecologically valid option that we have.
And why would that be the most ecological valid? What do you have that you do not have in electroshock?
I think with virtual reality, I think you can create an environment that would be closer to the environments that people would be in when they typically engage in self-harm. And I think that's why, if I compare it to like a lab study, of course, it's a lot more sterile. It's a lot more difficult to create that setting, and virtual reality, I think, would be ideal for something like that.
And do you also think that the role of seeing blood, for example, could play a role?
Yes, definitely. This was something that I found out recently myself, actually, because I know from clinical practice, a lot of people, when they engage in self-harm, they mention that seeing blood is an important part of it. And I know that there have been studies where they had these laboratory measures of self-harm, and they included some way of using fake blood. I don't know how practically they did it, but I do think that would also be a very interesting thing you can include in VR as well. So certainly, I think, yeah, seeing blood would be an important component.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And maybe a second one more related to the terms. You use the term self-harm, non-suicidal self-injury, and self-directed aggression. Can you use them as synonyms, or are there differences?
I think that, well, I can tell you the reason why I don't know where I used self-directed aggression by heart, but I know that I specifically used non-suicidal self-injury in some parts, and self-harm, I think mostly in my introduction discussion and like my presentation. I chose to do that because I feel like non-suicidal self-injury to me has more of a clinical connotation, and I think self-harm is more, it seems more of an umbrella term to me, but I do think that it would be helpful if we can find maybe some new term maybe that we can use to refer to forms of what I call self-harm that maybe are more like a low-grade self-sabotaging something like that. But yeah, so that's why I chose self-harm versus non-suicidal self-injury. Yeah.
Maybe I advise you to look, because the self-harm also includes the suicidality. It's coming from the UK, whereas the NSSI is the American tradition. So there is a lot of discussion going on. It's therefore that I refer to it, and it's quite interesting, I think, also for your studies. Do I still have time for a second question? Yeah, thank you already for these questions. Then I go to your anger manipulation, and we know from clinic and literature that anger plays an important role in NSSI. But yeah, here the manipulation didn't work that well. Do you have an idea or a reflection what you need to change in your anger manipulation, or the direction of the anger, or something like that, to have a higher effect on the behavior?
Yes, I think that, so for our first self-harm study or NSSI study, our anger induction, we used a video for it. And the video was also, it was a movie. I think there we then decided to change it for our next study because we thought maybe it needs to be more personal to feel that anger. And then our second self-harm study, the anger induction that we used, I think was effective in the sense that it is an effective anger induction. As far as I know from the literature, these autobiographical recall or writing tasks are the best way of doing it. But I think a next step further to really delve into the self-harm part, I do think another anger induction to do would be to like a self-directed anger induction, because I do, from what I understand, a lot of people who engage in self-harm, you have people who just talk about anger, but you also have a very big group of people who talk about self-directed anger. So I would want to include something that is more directed towards the self.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe even the combination with self-directed anger and self-criticism, because that seems also a very differentiating factor in that. And then a final question. Yeah. Have you also thought about the moderating effect of gender? Because aggression and gender is also related, or are the mechanisms similar in males and females? What are your thoughts?
And do you mean that specifically about self-harm or also aggression?
The relationship between boredom and aggression, would that be moderated by gender?
So I have, for our project, it wasn't gender, never was a focus, but definitely when I think about it, it may be, I know that typically you see that there is a tendency for men to be, self-report to be more bored than women. And with physical aggression, you see a slight difference where men tend to score higher on those measures. I don't know if when we're looking at the effect of boredom on aggression, specifically, it would be the case that for men that effect is stronger because, of course, there are a lot of other forms of aggression that we don't really, don't have very clear statistics about, like the more subtle forms or more relational forms of aggression that women also engage in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. The opposition will be continued by Professor Kai Jonas. He is Professor of Applied Social Psychology at Maastricht University.
Thank you very much, Pro-Rector. Congratulations, dear candidate, for this fantastic thesis. I really, really enjoyed reading it, and also to the promoters for facilitating this work of science. Why am I so thrilled about it? Because some years ago, many years ago by now, I had a similar idea, and I had a similar experience than yours, namely aggression in a cold pressure task after induction of boredom didn't work. So the cold pressure task can be ruled out, and I think there is really more to the link, and that's my second question that I want to ask. Now, your answer and your presentation triggered a new first question that I want to ask, namely you presented gambling as one of the consequences of boredom. And you also talked about sabotaging when answering to my colleague. And that got me thinking, wouldn't be gambling actually a really good measure for self-harm and sabotage? Because you're losing money. It's not physical self-harm. It's not a non-suicidal injury, but it is a severe injury, especially if you're coming from a lower socioeconomic status. And why I think it's a beautiful measure, but I would like to hear your opinion on that, is it also has this other directed component. Imagine you're a bored, low SEP employee, you're walking home, you're coming past the gambling location, you're bored from your 8 hours of medial work, and then you're gambling away money that you would actually need for your family. So you could actually play with a self-harm component and an other harm component, or how much the sabotaging would go. And wouldn't that be an interesting, so far overlooked DV for a consequence of loneliness? Sorry, not loneliness, boredom.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your generous words, and thank you for your question. I think, so I will think out loud. So with gambling, on the one hand, it absolutely, I think probably in most cases, it's complete self-sabotage in the long term. But there's also, why I'm maybe not hesitating a little bit, is because some people, when they gamble, sometimes you have really big rewards that come out of it. So then that makes it maybe a little bit different from self-harm in the sense that, yeah, you can have the really sabotaging part of it, but you also have moments where it's really rewarding. And then for the rewarding moments, I feel like naturally it's not strange for the average healthy person to want to engage more in that behavior because you had a huge reward out of it. But I think, yeah, cognitively it is more self-sabotaging. So yeah, I'm doubting a little bit because of those two things.
But I really like your answer. Because it allows us for a beautiful manipulation. You could have a rigged gambling task where you manipulate the successes and the failures. And you could play with how many failures and how many successes do you give, also in relation to potentially a strength of a boredom manipulation. And then you could tap a bit more into the procedure. When do people step out of the boredom, and what is sort of necessary?
Yes. Yes. And I got another thought in my head now that if you are someone who is bored and you engage in this gambling, so it would be, and it's not giving you anything and you're constantly losing, then my question would be, what is it that you're gaining from it? Because we are engaged, or when people engage in self-harm or with the sounds or with the shocks, it is because it gives them something. But I guess if you choose to gamble, you change your situation. You're coming out of the boredom, even though you lose. Yeah, I think it would be an interesting question to examine.
Well, thank you for this reflection. If I have a quick second question, and that's sort of related. Now you've manipulated the path from boredom induction to the DV sort of as a direct effect. Now, my question is sort of in the 21st century, and you mentioned also social media and smartphone use. What happens if we make the world a little bit more complex also in the experiment, and you bore the hell out of your participants, and then you give them a non-successful form of activity, namely passive smartphone use, the senseless scrolling, going down the rabbit hole. And you give them the opportunity, first of all, to end this, and then add the self-harm measure. Wouldn't that be more realistic, as you're not jumping immediately to administering electroshocks or cutting yourself, but you engage in sort of a relief, but it's not a relief?
Yes. I'm not completely sure, because what makes it complex, as you said, with the smartphones, I think when people go on their phones a lot, so there have been studies showing that it increases your boredom, but it's also the case that people go on their phone because they are bored and they want to alleviate that boredom. So it's like both, it's their coping style, so it's the self-sabotaging behavior, I think you could frame it that way, and it's also the boredom induction itself, because it's boring them further. So you have both elements in their use of the phone. But I mean, after they have used the phone, they are more bored. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to then see if after the boredom they engage in the electric shocks. Although I'm not sure. I don't know about this, which studies have first done a boredom induction and then given participants the opportunity to shock themselves. The studies that I've read about were only during, but I think it would be interesting. I don't know what the outcome would be there.
Well, room for more research.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'll give the word back to the rector.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Havermans, Remco Havermans. He is endowed professor of youth, food and health at the campus Venlo at Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, I've read your dissertation with great interest. I find boredom to be such an interesting emotion, and there's still so little research on this particular topic. So I highly value your dissertation, and I commend you, and of course also your supervisors for your important contributions to this area of research. But I have a question. So on several pages of your dissertation, you boldly assert boredom is an emotion. I agree. But in that context, I found it a bit surprising, only a bit, but a bit surprising that throughout your thesis, there's no reference, no discussion whatsoever of Nico Vrijda's thinking on emotions. You're not the only one. So I found this review paper by Dankert and Elpidoru, who published a theoretical discussion of boredom last year, a year ago. And they also don't mention Nico Vrijda at all. So Vrijda stated as one of his laws of emotions that any emotion is purposeful. So it has an adaptive function, implying that an emotion is always an intentional state. So Freida calls that state action readiness, right? And that action readiness is targeted towards an object or a person or a situation, something external to the individual. And the action readiness then includes a tendency, a behavioral tendency to either establish or break a relationship with that something external, object, person, situation, whatever. So on page 179, you state that in line with the argument made by Dankert and Elpidoru, 2023, its function, the function of boredom, certainly seems clear. Boredom acts as a signal that we are no longer optimally engaged. And you repeated that in your presentation, I believe. So thinking of Freida, I don't think that really counts as a proper functional account of boredom at all. So my first question to you is very simple. Why do we get bored?
Highly esteemed opponents, thank you for your kind words and for your question. I think your question, for me, taps into the whole, I call it the chaos of boredom research, of boredom definitions. I also wonder, why do we get bored? My guess, at least in the context that we're interested in it, if I had the opportunity to figure it out more, do some more research, I think it probably has to do something with a lack of meaning, at least in this context. But I know that there are researchers who say it can be a lack of meaning, or it can be a lack of attention, or a combination of both.
But couldn't those things, lack of meaning and lack of attention, be a consequence of boredom rather than the cause of it?
It could be, yeah, it could be, but I think it could be. And I think that what you said about the boredom as an emotion, and how, yeah, I also struggle with this because I tried to figure out, we call boredom an emotion. Generally speaking, in the literature, often people use that word, it's an emotion. I use that word as well, I think, because intuitively it just makes sense that, like, as an emotion, boredom. But then I know that when you look into some studies where they look at like facial features, that distinct facial expressions depending on emotions, because our facial expressions help us to distinguish between emotions. I know that for boredom, you don't have any distinct expressions.
What is that expression?
Yeah, so this is I would say, like a stereotypical expression that we all can associate with boredom. And colloquially, I think we all have a clear idea of what boredom means. It also shows in the fact that our experiments, we induced boredom and our participants report that they are bored. So we have a clear understanding of what it is, but when we try to actually describe it.
So, but if we do, sorry to interrupt you, but if you describe it in terms of action readiness, what is boredom? What does boredom do?
Yeah, it seems to me that all it does is that, so it's a signal that we're no longer engaged, but it pushes us to seek out anything else.
Exactly. And why is that important? Why does it help our survival as a species? Clearly, it has to help us in general.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have experienced any boredom. We wouldn't have that emotion. Not functional, it's just harmful.
Yes, no, I think it definitely, like the adaptive function of it, or like if I look at it from like an evolutionary perspective, I think it pushes us to seek out new experiences. New experiences, usually we learn new information about the world, about just everything that might help us survive better or something. I think it wouldn't be good if we didn't experience boredom, because then we would just be where we are and not interested in looking anywhere else. So I think that probably, in that sense, it helps us, it pushes us to explore, and it can have positive, it can have negative consequences.
That's interesting, but what kind of stuff or experiences are we then inclined to explore?
So do you mean specifically like positive, negative?
No, not so much. I'm thinking along the lines of stimuli. Aren't we just inclined to explore stimulation. We want to feel stimulated. So if that stimulation comes from very loud squealing pigs, so be it. Words don't do it for me. That's not stimulating. It's soothing, but I'm completely bored. I don't want anything soothing. I want to be stimulated.
So before we really got into all of our studies, I did have this idea, but then I know that in the literature, so first there was this idea boredom is low arousal. We seek some stimulation, so that's how we can explain certain behaviors. But then there's the discussion that no, it's not only low arousal. It's also possible that you're in a situation where it's very high arousal, you're overstimulated and you want something else where you can feel engaged and like in a flow of something, but it doesn't have to be something that's more stimulating than what you're already in. Sometimes you want something that's less stimulating and more engaging, but
Can you give an example of that?
yeah, so I hope this is a good example, but if I'm reading a paper that's really complex, I might sit and really try to understand and read it, but I don't get it. I'm not engaged because I can't like hook onto anything. So I stay in that state of overstimulation. And this is based on, some of these definitions. And so then if I were to find another paper that's less difficult, it's easier for me to understand. I can grasp it better. It's not more stimulating to me, but it is more engaging. I hope that's.
Well, yeah, we can discuss even more about that, but we'll save that for later. I have a second question. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah. I second question about proposition number 5, and I would like to invite one of your parents to read it out loud. Number 5.
The detrimental consequences of boredom should not be underestimated, especially considering that it may be on the rise nowadays due to smartphone use.
Thank you very much. Is that true, though? Is it on the rise due to smartphone use? You also mentioned it, I believe, in one of your answers to the previous questions. What especially is so boring about smartphone and smartphone use?
So I also honestly was a little bit surprised to find this, but there have been new studies that have come out where they measured people's boredom levels before they went on their phones and then after, and they always found that consistently it increases, even though people are on their phone. And my guess would be that when you are on your phone, typically a lot of the social media apps, we're scrolling constantly, or we're going through posts so quickly that we're not actually engaging with anything. Often, if you ask someone after they've been on their phone for an hour, if you ask them, what can you tell me about 5 specific posts that you read or saw, they can't really tell you because they're not really engaged. That's how I would guess that it's happening.
But isn't the scrolling constantly trying to find something until you hit upon that one stimulating nice bit of content? I can see if you're not finding it, then that's frustrating and boring, but it also motivates you to keep scrolling to find that interesting bit, right? And the fact that we occasionally do, that's like winning the lottery when you're gambling. That's it.
Yes, I don't think that anyone who goes on their phone is always bored. I think that probably if it's a long-term sort of thing, if you are on your phone a lot, if it doesn't provide you with like a net positive in some way, then I would guess you have to be very careful, because in those situations, I wonder if the boredom is it's like a symptom of something else that's underlying, maybe lacking meaning or something else, where you don't have any meaningful activity to be engaged in, so you do this. And I think that maybe that means that it's a different kind of boredom, but definitely I think it's boredom in the end.
Sure, that's interesting, the meaning bit. So
Hageman.
final question,
Small one?
very small. So
Small,
would that be an
small questions, small answer? Yeah.
Yeah. Would that be interesting to, as an alternative to mindfulness or smartphone use, is to somehow imbue repetitive tasks or monotonous acts with meaning.
Yes, yes. I think that would be something, if I had the opportunity to, I would want to do, to manipulate the meaning in an experimental setting and then see what that does to their behavior.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. The opposition will be continued by Professor Viviane de Vogel. She's endowed professor in forensic mental health care.
Thank you. Dear candidates, I would also like to start with complimenting you and also your supervisory team for this excellent piece of work. I truly enjoyed reading it and I found it to be inspirational. So in fact, I'm considering to include it in my own studies. And I especially like that you use different research designs. It seems like you really challenged yourself in them. So the compliments. Of course, I also have some questions. And in fact, the biggest question I had after reading your thesis was, how does it work in real life? And how can we translate your results to clinical practice, for instance? So your samples included students, your lab study, so mostly young, intelligent people, mostly women, I assume healthy. I work in forensic mental health care with many male patients. Severe trauma history, mental disorder, high levels of impulsivity, substance abuse. And these are all underlying risk factors for both aggression to others and self-injurious behavior. So it made me wonder, because you also included moderators in your studies, interesting moderators, psychopathy, emotional state, and negative urgency as a subscale of an impulsivity tool, as I understand correctly. And I wonder if you can explain a little bit more to me why you chose for these specific moderators, and have you also considered to look at mental health issues or trauma? Gender differences was already asked, but can you explain a bit more? And as a sub-question, do you have any ideas how to study this in real life situations?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your generous words and for your question. Sorry, what was the first part of your question?
So the moderators, why
Yes.
did you choose these moderators?
Yes. So when we went into each of these experiments, we kind of tried to figure out which moderators would be. There are, of course, a lot that you have to choose from. So we found that, for example, with boredom and aggression, we know that people with psychopathic tendencies also show higher levels of boredom proneness. So we know they also show higher levels of aggression. So we wondered, well, if we know those two things about people who score high on these traits of psychopathy, then we would expect they would also show a higher effect of boredom on aggression. With the and the other moderators, of course, were more like the basic traits of trait aggression, and then a history of self-harm. And then negative urgency was one that repeated in both of our NSSI experiments. And we chose that one because, well, from this, I think it was a meta-analysis where they looked at all the different measures of impulsivity, and they found that negative urgency was consistently correlated with self-harm behavior over all the other subscales of impulsivity that present themselves in the literature. So we thought then out of all of them, that makes sense to include that one. Of course, we have to limit ourselves. We couldn't choose all the different moderators, but yeah, that's what we based our decisions on for now.
Okay, and do you have any idea how to study this, like these other variables I mentioned, like trauma, mental health, to study this in real practice, real life situation?
Yes, so I think for real life, I think like a experience sampling method would be nice, because then it would be observational, but I think it would help us to get more information in general, especially in a clinical population, to ask people not only throughout their day about, are you bored, but also maybe add something about a little bit more specific, what exactly are you doing that's making you bored, or something like that, to get an idea of what are the activities that people find themselves in that then cause that boredom, or at least correlates with their boredom. And then also, so we can include some not only like measures of aggression and self-harm, but also some other things to see if there are other behaviors that people engage in after they're bored. But I think for a clinical sample, I would really like an experience sampling method.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Can I have another
Yes,
second
yes,
short
go ahead.
question? I have a sort of ethical consideration question. And I assume everything is okay because you had the ethical permission. But yeah, I found it notable that you had a relatively high prevalence of NSSI in your sample, 61%. So maybe a vulnerable group, I don't know. But you looked at the manipulation check and you found that the participants in your experimental condition had more confusion, frustration, fatigue. You did a full debrief, but did you also have the possibility to provide aftercare, for instance? Because I got a little bit worried about these participants.
Yes, so we always included in the debriefing some form of information about if you feel uncomfortable in any way, or if after the experiment you decide or you feel something was difficult for you, or you want any kind of maybe help or support from the researchers, you can always contact the researchers. So we did include that. Yeah.
Was there anyone who asked for help or?
Not that I know of.
No, okay.
No.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Are you reassured?
Yeah.
Okay. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Kai Karos. He is assistant professor in experimental health psychology at Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, also for me, congratulations on a really interesting thesis. Like, I really found it a fascinating thesis. Number one, because I really like experimental research, and I think it was really important to take the correlational literature and really try to see if you find a causal link. And second, because you managed to put all these constructs in this experimental literature that are so notoriously hard to put into a lab study, like boredom, what is it, how do you make it, aggression, how do you do that meaningfully in a lab, and self-harm. So I applaud you for the effort, and also your supervisors for thinking along how you can do that in the best possible way. My first question is a methodological one, because especially with the self-harm studies, you have your manipulation check, you check boredom, anger before, and you check it after your manipulation. But at the same time, by your own admission, you give them a coping strategy, right? You assume that people maybe shock themselves to cope with boredom, maybe even get out of boredom. So my first question is, would you agree with me that your manipulation check is actually contaminated by what the participants did during the study, during the manipulation? with a phone where you can do something. So I find that that is interesting, this difference. And I also remember that that was a nice feeling because it is unpleasant and you seek out something, but it makes you creative, right? Like it. But I remember the essence for me of what I thought I knew about boredom is not doing anything and finding that unpleasant. That was for me the essence. So when I saw your manipulation, I was surprised that rather than nothing, putting people in a room and not giving them anything, you let them watch a video over and over again, which to me, rather than boring, sounds really annoying and really frustrating, which is also what you found. And there I can see frustration leading to aggression and self-harm. But I wonder, is that really the same kind of boredom as just sitting there not being able to do anything? And why did you not go for that?
Yes, so I believe we did, there was a study where they also did this, where they just put participants in a room. I think that, but I would have to look it up for you afterwards. I think the reason why we used the video induction is because in previous studies, there was this study where they compared a bunch of different boredom induction methods, and they also included one where participants just sat in a room, and they found that the video was the most effective way of doing it. But I think that your question to me also, for me, triggers again, this chaos of boredom research, where this idea of frustration, I also wonder about this, like when do you reach a point where it's no longer just a frustration that's part of boredom, but it's just like it's another kind of emotion or state that you're tapping into.
Khouwaga Morsal, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request you and your company to await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
Wie is op de cover? Ja, dat is niet te zien. Doe het. Maak je me nodig staat. Gefeliciteerd met Please all rise. Please seated.
Khouwaga Morsal, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Dr. Lobbestaal is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Belooft u dat u altijd volgens de beginselen van wetenschappelijke integriteit te werk zult gaan, eerlijk en zorgvuldig, transparant, onafhankelijk en verantwoordelijk? Krachtens de bevoegdheid ons door de wet toegekend, volgens het besluit van de commissie hier tegenwoordig, verklaar ik u hierbij, Khouwaga Youssoufzai, tot dokter te bevorderen en alle rechten te verlenen die daaraan volgens wet en gewoonte zijn verbonden. En ten bewijze hiervan overhandig ik u nu de bul, door rector, secretaris en overgeleden van de promotiecommissie ondertekend en met het grootzegel van de universiteit bevestigd.
Please be seated.
Zo, mag ik ook de laudatio uitspreken? En het vroeg je om met het Nederlands te doen, dus dat ga ik doen. Beste Morsal, hier sta je dan op de berg met de dokterstitel op zak. Dr. Youssoufzai. We hebben elkaar voor het eerst ontmoet toen je zo'n 6 jaar geleden je masterthesisonderzoek wou doen bij mij naar agressie en verveling. En mijn eigen PhD, dus de student destijds Francie Dambacher, die had jouw bachelorthesis begeleid en die had mij al getipt dat ik jou absoluut moest aannemen. Want die thesis die je bij haar had geschreven, die was namelijk zo goed dat die destijds meteen gepubliceerd is. En jij was eerste auteur in een internationaal tijdschrift. En dat is wat men noemt een binnenkomer van formaat. Tijdens je masterthesis en toen we daarna een boekhoofdstuk schreven, bleek ook overduidelijk, bij jou was meteen elk project in goede handen. En ik bood je daarom ook een baan aan als onderzoeksassistent en stilaan bleken we dat we genoeg materiaal hadden om over te gaan tot een PhD-project. En ik herinner me heel goed hoe je reageerde op mijn suggestie een PhD-traject te starten. Complete en algehele verbazing. En die avond heb je blijkbaar tegen je zus gezegd, weet je wat Jill voorstelt? Hoe komt ze daar nu bij? Ik? Maar ik wist heel goed wat ik deed. En ik haalde Sjaan en Linda erbij om je promotieteam compleet te maken. En ook zij zagen meteen jouw potentieel. En doorheen de jaren heb je dat absoluut waargemaakt. We hebben jou leren kennen als iemand die serieus is, competent en heel erg toegewijd. En tegelijkertijd ben je ook een twijfelaar. Je weekt en je weegt, maar als je dan besluit om ervoor te gaan, dan doe je dat voor de volle 100%. En je stelt hoge eisen aan jezelf, ook aan anderen, maar je vecht ook voor datgene waar je in gelooft. Elk PhD-traject komt helaas ook met uitdagingen en zo had jij ook de jouwe. En ik noem er 2. De eerste was de Mozaïek NWO Grant-aanvraag. En jij raakte tot in de interviewfase en dat is niet niks. Maar daar had jij de moeilijke opdracht om een interdisciplinaire commissie van zeer senior juryleden te overtuigen dat jij de beste was. En zo'n interview is zo spannend dat het zelfs veel meer ervaren onderzoekers zoals wij ook nog steeds zwaar imponeert, maar jij deed dat gewoon. En de tweede uitdaging die je tegenkwam waren de bots. Ik ben er zeker van dat je nog steeds rillingen krijgt als ik nu het woord gewoon uitspreek. Je kwam er namelijk achter dat een aantal zogenaamde proefpersonen uit je online onderzoek tijdens corona geen echte mensen waren, maar bots. En alle alarmbellen gingen af. Je ging voor de better safe than sorry aanpak een beetje als een pitbull vast in alle details van de data. En dat heeft je veel slapeloze nachten bezorgd. Wij waren onder de indruk van hoe gedegen dat je daarin te werk ging en zelfs voor de faculteit mee een algemeen botbeleid uitwerkte. Het viel ons ook hierin op dat je zeer sterke normen en waarden aanhoudt. Jij kwam er in het spitten naar bots bijvoorbeeld achter dat sommige andere wetenschappers, en ik durf geen namen te noemen nu, want er bestaat nog steeds het gevaar dat je uit je vel springt, het niet zo nauw namen met de botdetectie. En je kon je verontwaardiging daarover niet onderdrukken. En dit laat ook zien hoe hoog jij good scientific practice in het vaandel houdt. Naast werk is ons duidelijk geworden wat voor jou echt belangrijk is in het leven. En op nummer 1 staat voor jou, zonder concurrentie, jouw familie. En het siert je enorm hoe liefde en respectvol jij spreekt over de bezorgdheid en de kookkunsten van je moeder, de stille trots van je vader en hoe je zussen en nichtjes je eerste go-to's zijn bij twijfel en nood. Je omarmt je Afghaanse roots en tradities en we vergeten nooit hoe prachtig je gekleed was in de traditionele jurk tijdens het huwelijk van je zus. En een andere belangrijke rol in je leven is weggelegd voor kunst. We zagen je fantastische tekeningen en schilderijen voor het eerst als achtergrond in corona tijdens de Zoom-meetings. En nu is hier een tekening van jouw verveelde zus, de cover van je proefschrift. En wat ik vandaag vooral wil benadrukken, Morsal, is hoe ongelooflijk trots wij, Sjaan, Linda en ik, op jou zijn. Je groeit te zien door ogen als onderzoeker, maar ook als mens en bijvoorbeeld ook in je omgang met studenten. Niet alle studenten zijn namelijk even hardwerkend. En op het begin van je onderwijscarrière ging jij daarom super hard lopen voor hen. En nu zien we een docent die weet wanneer het beter is om verantwoordelijkheid terug te leggen bij de student, met veel meer rust en zelfverzekerdheid. Ik wil tot slot ook een kleine bekentenis doen over ons als supervisoren. Ondanks al je lovende woorden en ons in je dankwoord, denk ik dat je soms toch ook wel afzag met ons. Dit trio was namelijk vaak overenthousiast als we getuigen waren van je successen. De snelle vooruitgang, de scherp geschreven artikels en het vlotte publicatieproces. Op al deze successen reageerde jij dan op je eigen, zeer nuchtere manier, terwijl wij bijna ontploften van enthousiasme. En ik denk dat dat soms wel wat overweldigend voor je was. Dit gezegd zijnde, waren wij een heel mooi team, denk ik, en die onszelf trouwens ook de Four Non-Boards noemden, met analogie van de Four Non-Blondes. Maar dit hebben hun de 2 blonde dames gesaboteerd. Morsal, we kijken vandaag vol blijdschap en trots achterom naar het traject dat je aflegde en de enorme veelheid werk die je hebt verzet. In het proefschrift dankwoord schreef je nog: ik had nooit gedacht dat dit mogelijk was voor iemand als ik. Maar besef heel goed, Morsal, dat het totaal anders is dan hoe wij jou zien. Net voor iemand als jij, net voor jou, is het mogelijk gebleken. En hoe? Je bent een stille kracht, loyaal, toegewijd en hardwerkend. En je bent iemand die alles kan als je eraan commit. En het was voor ons een absolute eer om jou te mogen begeleiden. Maak er vandaag nog een feestelijke dag van, samen met je vrienden en familie.
Okay, dear Dr. Yusoufzai, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with this nice thesis and your nice work. If you feel bored, please read The Emotions by Nico Freda. It's a good book. Voor de rest een paar mededelingen. Zo dadelijk gaan wij eerst met de kandidaten even naar de trappen. We maken daar wat traditiefoto's. Ook Nederland heeft tradities. En ik verzoek het publiek alvast even naar de refter te gaan. Neem een drankje en we sluiten snel aan. En daarmee sluit ik deze academische zitting.
Please all rise.